My superpower is engineering. I've been a roboticist almost all my life now. I think engineering is just as creative as the arts. Engineers, we solve problems. It impacts the world. It makes a difference. Without IEEE, I don't think I would have the network that I have. Anyone can get involved with IEEE USA at any time. There's an immense amount of value for anyone at any career stage.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to today's IEEE USA Livestream Webinar, Navigate the Phases of Team Development with Speed and Agility for Happier and More Productive Teams. I'm your host, Jonathan Cho. IEEE USA's goal is to create programming that is valuable, relevant, and of interest to you, and as such, we will be sending a short survey to all of our registrants after this event and would love your feedback. We value your opinions and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes and share your thoughts. Our presenter for today's webinar is Scott Graffius. Scott has generated over $1 billion of business value in aggregate for the organizations that he's served. He's an agile project management practitioner, consultant, award-winning author, and international speaker. Without further ado, I will now pass it over to Scott to introduce himself as well. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. I'm Scott Graffius, and this is Navigate the Phases of Team Development with Speed and Agility for Happier and More Productive Teams. There's a IEEE article that I would like to excerpt here, and that is companies intent on maintaining a competitive edge are calling upon educators to produce engineers capable of leading multidisciplinary teams. And this article here in this IEEE journal speaks to educating engineers before they enter the workforce, as well as leadership skills and other soft skills once they're actually in the workforce. And it relates directly to this presentation, so I wanted to share it. One other excerpt I'd like to share, and this one's from the DevOps skill report, and that is a leader must be skilled in empowering and developing others to be able to go beyond oneself to help the group. So really it's talking about engineers taking that next step by really applying soft skills, leadership being one of them. And that, of course, is applicable to this talk. So I wanted to lead with those. Up front, I want to mention that for content accessibility purposes, this presentation deliberately uses relatively large size fonts and high contrast elements such as black text on a white background. And I'll be describing the on-screen content. There are a few cases, particularly at the beginning, where I'll be reading it maybe almost word for word, but for most slides, that won't be the case. Just wanted to let you know up front, and we're off. Want happier and more productive teams? And who doesn't? So among other things, it takes great leadership, and there are some proven strategies, and they can give a real advantage. And that's where this phases of team development comes in. It's a framework that stood the test of time because it remains highly relevant and beneficial. Some examples to follow in a moment. So if you're a leader, a technical leader, or you like to be one, a member of a team, or you might be one in the future, and that covers just about everybody, or you're just looking to develop your related skills. This talk, which is based on Dr. Bruce Tuckmans' model, but with a fresh angle, and that is 0% theory, 100% practical information. We'll give you a framework with actionable tips that you can use and apply right away for working in and leading teams successfully. So here are the objectives for this talk. After the session, you should understand the 5 phases of team development, the characteristics of each one, and then most importantly, the usable strategies for navigating all the phases from start to finish. So here's the agenda. This is how this talk is structured. We have the introduction, objectives, and agenda, and we're almost done with that. Some about information as it relates to me and this conversation. The main portion of this talk is the 5 phases of team development. And then we'll have a quick wrap-up conclusion a digital download takeaway, and Q&A. So here's some about information to augment what Jonathan had shared at the beginning. I'm a agile project management practitioner, consultant, author, and speaker. And I've spoken in 19 countries, 55 talks across 19 countries so far. This is talk 56. I'm the founder and CEO of Exceptional PPM and PMO Solutions, and most recently, our new division is Exceptional Agility. And I'm very proud to be a member of the IEEE, also the Project Management Institute and the Scrum Alliance. And I have 8 professional credentials. The first 5 are Agile and Scrum specific, to be more particular, followed by the Project Management Professional, ITIL, and Lean Six Sigma. And my background spans diverse industries, everything from entertainment and government to high-tech, telco, and more. And I'm quite honored that content from my books, which are 2, and speaking engagements, workshops have been used by a variety of organizations. Here are a few examples. I'll highlight some of them from this list here briefly. Computer Weekly, the United States Department of Energy, Gartner, Oracle, Microsoft, Warsaw University of Technology, Virginia Tech, and others. And so here we are, onto the main attraction, the 5 phases of team development. Dr. Bruce Tuckman, who received his PhD in psychology from Princeton, did extensive research on what was initially referred to as group dynamics, shortly thereafter called team dynamics, team development, group development. So in the context of this presentation, those terms are used interchangeably. And he published his model in 1965. But why are we talking about something from 1965, you might ask? And if you did, the answer is because that's still highly relevant and beneficial today. Examples to follow. This talk draws on my own firsthand real-world experience using the model, and it's supported by research and recommendations from a variety of sources. Microsoft, IEEE, Harvard Business Review, Forbes CIO, Fast Company, MIT, The Next Web, and IBM, to name a few. These 9 examples, 2 mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, and then some additional ones for a grand total of 40. That's what I've captured in the select bibliography for this talk, which is available for you as a download along with additional content to be talked about at the end of this presentation. But I just wanted to show you these 9 because they're diverse and they do speak directly to Dr. Bruce Tuckman's model in this conversation. And to underscore the continuing relevance and value, those 9 examples I showed you were all published in the last 10 years, and many of them in the last year. So I don't know about you, but when it comes to models, incorporating them or transforming them into visuals can often be quite helpful. And that's exactly what I did for this presentation. For this talk, though, clip art just does not work. And no stock photos, and there's definitely no generic content in this presentation, all custom. So here's the phases of team development, which is a custom visual to give sort of the overview for this presentation. Now, as mentioned at the top of this talk, content is presented with a large font, so it's easy for visibility. And obviously with this particular visual, you won't be able to make out all the details. The purpose of showing it to you on screen here is to kind of give you the overall layout. And then we'll be zooming in on aspects of this visual, and it'll be quite clear on screen in just a moment as we do that. But at the top here, you see a graph, and you have the performance and the phase, and it shows how, for example, going across the 5 columns, forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning, which, by the way, Dr. Tuckman says are necessary and inevitable for teams to grow and progress. So the teams move from left to right. If we have time at the end, I can talk about how there might be some exceptions, and then how to get the team back on track in terms of maybe the direction moving the other way. But forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. So as you can see, just by quickly glancing at the graph at the top of this visual, the lowest phase in terms of performance is storming, and the highest is performing. So looking at the table aspect of this graph, we have, again, the 5 columns that I mentioned. The first row are the characteristics. These are the behaviors or the things that you typically see in the respective phase. So if you're unfamiliar with the model, it's really effectively the diagnostic criteria for where is the team if it isn't obvious exactly where the team is. So that's what the characteristics are. And then below those are the strategies. These are the things that can be done to help the team grow and advance, which really typically means moving on to the next phase. You know, earlier I was showing some examples of items that are in the bibliography. My role, as I see it, is to know the literature on this subject quite well. So I've read hundreds of studies related to Dr. Tuckmans' model, published since, because it's been quite a while since 1965. And so one of the unique aspects of this talk is to transform the information from the literature into these practical, usable strategies. So that's what sets this presentation apart. Many publications talk about how the model is beneficial and helpful, and that's informative and that's great. But here I want to give you practical information, and so that's what I've done here, is summarizing the proven strategies from the literature. So, but this is all about people, right? And so I wanted to have a visual to accompany the visual you just saw that is really reflective of the team throughout the 5 different phases of team development. And, you know, Dr. Tuckmans' model was created in 1965. And for inspiration, I looked to that year to see if anything resonated that could maybe be utilized for this presentation. I didn't find anything that really stood out, or in 66 or 67 or 68. But in 1969, some characters were created. Any Lego fans out there? So this is another custom image that was created just for this presentation. And these characters were created in 1969. Of course, this version or this format is more modern because it's the Lego version. And by the way, these things are expensive, I found out. So each of the 5 phases in detail, we're off. First up is forming. It's the first of the 5 phases. And here's a visual that is reflective of a group of people coming together for the first time. It may be people who have worked together before. Maybe they haven't worked together before, or a mix. And by the way, I realized that some attendees might associate with project work, and others might be more continuous with DevOps. So I'll give examples that speak to both project work as well as DevOps. So here you have a group of people coming together for the first time. In the case of a project, it's for a new endeavor. And here are the behaviors that you typically see. Things are new, and with that comes some eagerness and excitement, and people are socializing. In terms of tone, generally polite, people sticking to safe topics. But you know what? Even if they've worked together before, this is a unique endeavor, right? And so they might be unclear about exactly how they fit in and how they'll be, as a member of the team, producing the deliverables that have been set forth for the scope of this project or this endeavor. So it's perfectly normal that there's some level of anxiety and questioning. And as you might expect, the literature is quite clear that these characteristics are applicable to all scenarios. They're agnostic, whether it's DevOps or whether it's project work, and the types of project, agile or non-agile, right? These are still applicable. When team members have worked together before, the anxiety and the questioning tends to be lower. So in other words, if somebody's never worked on a project before, or this kind of a project, their anxiety and questioning might be a little higher. But anyways, that's what the literature is clear on, and I do want to share that. So these are normal and healthy, according to Dr. Tuckman, and the research since, which has been extensive. So here are the strategies to help the team grow and advance. And that really means move on to the next phase. And that is that somebody, and it could be anybody, it could be a project manager, a scrum master, an agile coach, a DevOps manager, maybe somebody who's related to the endeavor but is outside the immediate project, like a project sponsor. Somebody, Dr. Tuckman is agnostic about who this person is taking the lead and being very visible. And in some organizations, introductions like icebreakers can be helpful. You know, this also may not surprise you that, or it may, but that even when you have people who have worked together before, there is still, according to the literature, some benefit to spending, say, 5 or 10 minutes at the very beginning to do an icebreaker. The more people who haven't worked on the team in the past, the increased value of doing such an exercise. So whatever is appropriate for your organization, doesn't have to be an icebreaker, but some form of quick, brief introductions can go a long ways. Providing the big picture. It's perfectly normal, even on large projects, to not know all the details on day one. But there's probably some sort of a mission or a vision or a scope or a charter that relates to, or an epic is the term that's used in agile situations sometimes, or a theme that really relates to the work that's being going to be embarked upon. And so to share whatever's available at the beginning rather than later, establishing clear expectations. I'll give you an example. This one is specific to Agile Scrum, but you'll get the idea, I hope. And that is, let's say it's an Agile Scrum team, and the expectation is that every workday from 9 to 9:15 local time, the team will get together, whether it's Zoom or whether it's in person or hybrid, and they'll talk about what they accomplished since the last meeting, what they're going to do in the new workday, and any issues or impediments that they've experienced. It's a quick meeting, and that's why it's called a stand-up meeting, because at least pre-COVID, people were actually meeting in person, and it was recommended that people stand up to help facilitate this meeting being a quick one. So if that's the expectation, share that up front. Share whatever the expectations are up front. I'll talk more about that example in coming slides. Communicating success criteria. So this one, I'll give you an example. In some organizations, there are top-down dates. We need to have this completed by 2 weeks from now. We need to have this completed by October 1st, or whatever it is. If that's the case, better to know it sooner rather than later. So sharing things like the success criteria for the project or the endeavor can be extremely helpful in getting the team to grow and advance. And response times being quick. Some of these things, these characteristics or strategies, you might think, well, they're just applicable to almost all the phases. These strategies are the ones that are particularly helpful for this phase of forming to getting the team to move forward. And next up is the storming phase. Here it's a very different visual. It's people are at a little bit of a minor conflict or loggerheads, if you will. And some of the characteristics are, it's perfectly normal, according to Dr. Tuckman and subsequent research, that there's some level of initial resistance, maybe translated as a lack of participation. And it might be based on differences of opinion and feelings. And regardless of people's official titles in the organization, there might be some sort of formal or informal, maybe even unconscious jockeying for position or competition to see who's going to be the number one, the number two, or whatever in this project or this endeavor. And along with that can come high emotions relative to other phases. And then in mature organizations, and the one definition of that is people who have worked together before, typically, and can get to the performing phase quickly. this phase of storming can be quite short. There was one attendee at a talk that I did a few months ago who said that based on the characteristics, she believed that her team was in the storming phase for the whole duration of the project after forming. They never got out of storming. Well, as you might recollect from that graph shown at the beginning, performance does occur during storming. It just happens to be the lowest level of performance. Really, the goal is to get to the performing phase for the highest level of performance, which is also part of the reason for the title of this talk, is when you do satisfaction surveys or pulse surveys or whatever they're referred to in your organization. Typically, the satisfaction level is the highest. People are the happiest during the performing phase. So here are the strategies to help the team grow and advance and move out of storming into phase 3, which is norming. Requesting and encouraging feedback might sound very obvious, but let me give you an example of what's really meant by this by the literature. And that is that somebody, through what they say and what they do, is really requesting encouraging feedback. For example, maybe it's a kickoff meeting that somebody says, if you come across any problems or issues, don't feel like you need to wait until the next day in our stand-up meeting or whatever venue to share that. Please come by my office or send me a text or send me an email. In other words, make it really easy and frictionless for somebody to provide feedback. And that it's not a one-off conversation, that it's something that is reinforced in communications and meetings. I know one project team that in the footer of all the status updates, which are sent out periodically, it says, it reinforces that I want to hear your feedback. If you have come across any issues or impediments, don't wait, please let me know now, click here, or however they want to relate that information. And, part of that, speaking to the second bullet point here, is that, some of the larger issues are sort of self-revealing. And by that, I mean an outage or something like that. People know about things quite quickly, typically the larger things, but it's these smaller issues or impediments that once they're raised, I don't know about you, but it's hard to address something if you don't know about it, that take their toll on a project if they're not addressed. And so by really requesting and encouraging feedback, you can uncover these issues, large and small. Building trust by honoring commitments, the last bullet point I want to jump to here, really is picking up on the example I gave earlier of a daily stand-up or a daily scrum from 9 to 9:15 every workday. So how do you build trust? Well, according to the literature, and I'll translate it to the example I gave you earlier about this daily stand-up, it is by honoring commitments. So listen, things happen. And there may be a very good reason for 1 or 2 daily stand-up meetings to be canceled. But earlier, that expectation is that they would happen every workday. If 3 or 4 of them get canceled in a row, well, there's no better way to erode trust. But by honoring your commitments and having those meetings, using that as just one example, that's a really good and easy way to build trust. So that's how you build trust, is by honoring commitments. And next up is the third phase, which is norming, which is the second highest level in terms of performance. And here's a very different visual. It's really reflecting not a hierarchy, but rather how people are interconnected. Very different from earlier visuals. Here are the characteristics. The purpose and goals, compared to earlier phases, are well understood, which translates to higher confidence and improved commitment. People are engaged and supportive, and if there was any anxiety earlier, which according to the literature is normal, it's lowered or eliminated during the norming phase. And then speaking to the visual, the last bullet point, developing cohesion. So the team is starting to develop cohesion and connect with one another. So here are the strategies to help the team grow and advance and move on to phase 4, which is performing, which is the highest level. So recognizing individual and team efforts Certainly that can be done at the very end of the project or endeavor, but it can be also done while the project is in flight. Providing learning opportunities and feedback. In here, compared with earlier, where the leader, whoever that is, the Scrum Master, Project Manager, DevOps lead, whoever that person is, was very visible and upfront. Here, things are starting to go very well and just on the cusp of moving to the highest level of performance. So this leader is kind of pulling back a bit and monitoring the team. Monitoring the energy of the team is sometimes characterized here. And so that's why it's listed. And whenever there's issues or problems, intervening as appropriate. And then we have phase 4, performing the highest level of performance. Here, a very different visual, right? Everyone interconnected. And I think it's the last bullet point here. Yes, I'm going to jump to the last one. Demonstrations of interdependence and self-management is really what you see during the performing phase. High motivation, trust, and empathy, individuals deferring to team needs versus personal needs. And the team is definitely producing deliverables and they're consistent and it's the highest level. So here are the strategies to help the team grow and advance. So if you were to ask the question, because it is one of the frequently asked questions, I thought I'd just proactively address it. What are you talking about? This is the highest level of performance. How can the team grow and advance? Well, keep in mind, this is an active phase. The project isn't done yet. And there is phase 5, a journey, which kind of covers that. So here the team is performing actively. So this is really about keeping the momentum going. These are strategies to help the team's momentum continue. Guiding from the side or minimal intervention, kind of as described earlier. Celebrating successes or milestones on the project along the way. And then encouraging collective decision-making and problem-solving. The team is probably already doing that. And if they are, it's reinforced. And if they're not, you're encouraging them to do so to the extent that it's appropriate for your culture and your environment. And then the last phase is a journey. And here's a very different visual. It's really sort of the opposite of the forming, right? People are disbanding. And in the case of a project, the deliverables the scope has been fulfilled. An example of a journey as appropriate or as relevant for a DevOps organization, which is really continuous and kind of never stops, really. An example of a journey would be maybe taking a pause for planning. Maybe every DevOps organization is different, but maybe you have a retrospective or some sort of a demarcation in the team where you take stock of things. And so that would be applicable to a journey. So the characteristics of the team. So in 1965, Dr. Tuckman introduced 4 phases: forming, storming, norming, and performing. However, in 1977, he personally added the adjourning phase. And because he personally added it to his own model, there are 5 phases. Now, it's been, and this was in 1977, right? So it's been 44 years since he updated his own model. Yet, if you were to go on Google, you would find roughly 50% of, depending on the keywords you put in to search, around 50% of content, including presentations, talking about how there's 4 phases, meaning there's only 4, which is not true. So that was 44 years ago that he updated it. Maybe in another 44 years, we'll have everybody on board. But anyways, I did want to share that. So if anybody tells you, well, what are you talking about? There's 4 phases. You can say, no, Dr. Tuckman added the 5th phase in 1977 because it's so important. And it's also been referred to subsequently often as the transitioning or the mourning phase. And here's why. This I found to be counterintuitive, but the literature is quite clear. So I did want to share this with you. On the one hand, picture this. You worked on this project or this DevOps team with great success, and things went quite well and you achieved exactly what the company needed to disrupt the industry in a good way, or to increase sales or decrease costs or improve the infrastructure, or whatever the scope was, a new product or service. But the team is disbanding. Particularly, we're talking about a project team here. The team is disbanding. And so some team members can experience sadness from that, because especially if, according to the literature, somebody doesn't normally work on teams, and let's just say in the case of a large project, which are becoming more rare nowadays, they tend to be smaller incremental projects, but let's just say it is a large project, and let's say it ran for 6 months and had 100 people on it. Well, that person probably spent almost all of her or his time dedicated to that project, and now it's over and they're going back to where they, the department that they had come from in their role previous to the project. So there can be sadness. Didn't want to call that out. I haven't experienced it, but the literature is clear, so I wanted to share that. But there are things that can be done about that. Recognizing team and individual efforts can occur even if there isn't a retrospective or a post-project review or postmortem, whatever it's called, covered more on the next slide. And of course, disbanding. That's really what the visual is, disbanding. So here are the strategies to help the team grow. So in this case, the project is over. And if I was to elaborate the headline here, or the header, I would say strategies to help the individuals on the team, and the company grow. So first of all, to acknowledge the change, to explicitly say, thank you very much, and for somebody in the organization to acknowledge the efforts made by the team and to recognize the change, and what that means is people going back to the departments they come from, or whatever is appropriate in your environment. Given an opportunity for team evaluations, sometimes called lessons learned, sometimes called retrospective, postmortem, post-project review. Doesn't really matter what the label is. The individual questions can also vary, but they're typically things along the lines of what went well, what didn't go well, what would we change going forward. And what that really provides is an opportunity for the organization to have a competitive advantage if it captures that information and incorporates that lesson into its processes. It is in an improved state for the next time it does a project similar to or identical to this endeavor. Giving the second to the last bullet point here, giving an opportunity for individual acknowledgements, and celebrating the last bullet point, the team's accomplishments. Even with COVID, which is challenging for folks, the in-person parties or celebrations on site, or maybe even at a restaurant, are much more difficult to do with COVID. I worked at one organization where the CEO decided to send everyone on the team a $100 American Express gift card that they could then use for themselves or their families to kind of have their own celebration, and to join a Zoom call where they all celebrated together. And celebrating the team's accomplishments, some organizations might call it a party. Sometimes in some organizations there's that. And speaking of which, this is also from the literature, which I found surprising. And I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but whether you're surprised or not as well. And that is this. When somebody of authority in the organization, a CTO, a CEO, a head of a department, whoever that person is that's related to this endeavor, acknowledges the contributions of the team, the hard work, the diligence, and the success of the team, and makes those announcements to the broader company, the benefits are definitely to the individuals on the team. This part surprised me, though. The benefits are almost equally significant to people in the company who had nothing to do with the project. And the reason for that is that the company is voicing how it appreciates the hard work and diligence of team members. And so again, even for people who weren't involved in the project, it can be quite motivating. And so that surprised me, but the literature is quite clear about that. So those are the key highlights for the 5 phases of team development. And I'd like to give you a quick wrap up, talk about the takeaway, and then we'll move into Q&A. So forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning are all, according to Dr. Tuckman, are all inevitable for teams to grow and deliver results. And this presentation covered the 5 phases, including the characteristics of each one and the usable strategies for effectively navigating the team from start to finish. So said differently, the team on its own without these interventions or strategies may or may not get to performing, but they can get there quicker with these strategies for sure. As mentioned, I have a bibliography. It's 40 items covering the examples I showed you, the 2 at the very beginning, the 9 that I mentioned, like Harvard Business Review, the IEEE, and others, and more, for a total of 40. And then, in case you'd like to learn more about this, and then the main visual for this presentation. So this is a 2-page high-resolution PDF that I created just for you for attending this IEEE Day talk. And if you'd like it, it's available download at bit.ly/IEEE-7, all in lowercase. One more time, bit.ly/IEEE-7. A little more on that before we move on to the next slide. And that is that I wanted, if you're interested in this, I wanted this to be as easy, as quick, and as frictionless as possible. So while I would love to connect with you and, through LinkedIn and other ways, I didn't want to have you put in any information to get this download. If you simply go to this URL, this image, this 2-page PDF will display. It might take a moment to load on your screen, and then you can save it. I don't capture your name or your email or anything like that at all, and it's non-authenticated. So I just wanted to make it easy, and so I wanted to explain why I did that. And here we are moving on to the Q&A portion of this talk. So I'd like to turn it back over to Jonathan, and I look forward to your feedback and any questions that you have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Scott. Folks, it is we are at the Q&A segment of the presentation. Please post your comments or questions please post your questions in the comment section, and we'll load them onto the screen for Scott to answer. And while we work on getting the questions, we'll have Scott return to StreamYard to join with us. Scott, here's our first question from our audience. So Frank asks, how can we pick up and encourage team members not quite pulling their weight in responsibility?
Well, thank you for all of the feedback and questions. And that's one that I have come across occasionally personally. And so I think the answer is, it really depends on your company and the culture and organization. But I will speak sort of generally about it, and that is talking about expectations and being really specific. I understand the problem of somebody not pulling their weight. And I'm not suggesting that the person asking the question would say to somebody, you're not pulling your weight. What I would suggest is, and I think the person was Frank, I think what Frank would probably do, and what I would recommend do, is first of all, as things come up, address them and not, let them accumulate. And to be very specific. So for example, if a person's not, quote, pulling their weight because they're not attending the meetings, to be really specific, you're not attending your meetings. And the exact remedy, if the person doesn't respond appropriately to that, again, is to the culture of your particular environment, your unique environment. But it may mean, in a total worst case scenario, which I think is important to talk about, sort of the spectrum being mentioned to the person, maybe it gets resolved. And then the total worst case is to talk with that that person's manager or whatever's appropriate, maybe that person needs to be replaced on the team if they're not pulling their weight, or they're not able to, they're not willing or able, those are two different things, of course, to do the work. I hope that's helpful, and I look forward to more questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Scott. And Jennifer, I do see your comment. Thank you so much for the compliment. I really appreciate it. Scott, here is our next question from our audience.
Well, wait a minute. What did Jennifer say?
Oh, it was a one directed towards me, actually.
Oh, okay. Very good.
Sorry for that. Brief interruption. Scott, so here is our next question.
Okay.
So a LinkedIn user, audience member asks, do you have any team templates that you would recommend? I am assuming aside from the one that you provided, and do you have any other resources that you've seen that have really like helped you kind of like build this, that really helped in, that you utilized in building this one on the screen right now?
Yeah, I have developed some models and some templates. The feedback I've received from them is that they are, as part of my consulting, is that they can be effective, but that isn't there something simpler to use? Sort of and actually one of the items of feedback I got several years ago is, a one-pager, if you will. And I totally get what that person was where they were coming from. That particular person's preference and style wasn't to have a big document that needed to be filled out, whether it's a paper document or it's something you can do on the web or an app, right? But rather something that can be printed out and on one piece of paper and kind of give you the overall layout. And that's where this visual came from. It was sort of the genesis for this particular visual, creating this. And I've updated this periodically. I would say every 12 to 18 months, I put out a new version. And the version that you see before you is the most current version that was released January of this year. So yeah, I have developed some tools and some templates, but typically the feedback has been that they prefer having a simpler approach and maybe just a one-on-one meeting with folks versus a template that needs to be filled out. I think I'd like to give maybe one more example in response to the question, and that is one thing that I have found extremely helpful is when it comes to forming the team. We're talking about a project, right? When it comes to forming a team, is to share whatever information is available up front with whoever are the respective managers who will be, assigning the team members, so that you have a very good chance in having people who have the ability to fulfill the scope of the project. And the willingness question really maybe was something that Frank was asking about earlier. Perhaps, I'm not sure if that was a willingness or an ability question, but anyways, I did want to add that. And thank you for the question. Any additional questions?
Fantastic, thank you. And we did have one comment from our audience member, Carl, who said he found the Rocket model by Hughes, Ginnett, and Curfey as a useful model as well, along with their team leadership model. So thank you, Carl, for that insight. Our next question.
And Jonathan?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's something that was being alluded to in that comment, but I am familiar with a variety of different models, and I know the literature quite well. I can't know every model on the planet, but what the literature is clear about is that this model is a agnostic model that is applicable to a wide variety of scenarios and situations and can be complementary to other models. In other words, the literature hasn't come across another model so far that is effective and contradicts this model. So this model can be just sort of a supplement to or companion to other models.
Gotcha. Thank you, Scott. And for our audience members, we do like to emphasize that I've posted the link to Scott's takeaway resource in the comment section, so you can just go to that link directly and download the resource that the link takes you to. So, Scott, our next question from our audience, Brent asks, what hinders movement from norming to performing?
Well, the flip side of what hinders it is what can be done to help it. And if there's any challenges in terms of, if you look at, for example, the strategies, talking about acknowledging team efforts. So the difference between the norming and the performing phase is obviously performing is higher, but there is performance that is occurring during norming. And it's really getting the team to its peak level of performance. And giving feedback and recognizing efforts just goes a really long ways. That might sound, I realize, very simplistic, but the effectiveness and the value of doing that cannot be overemphasized by myself. And I'm speaking from experience, and I'm also trying to reflect to the best ability I have. The literature is quite clear on that. So that's what can be done. And if there's any challenges in doing that, which perhaps speaks to the question about providing learning opportunities and feedback and acknowledging efforts, I don't know if it's a cultural issue or not, meaning it may not be unique to this particular model. So without knowing any additional details related to the question, that's the best answer I have, and I hope that helps.
I think it does. Thank you so much for that insight. And thank you, Brent, for the question. This next question from Robert, how do you help others to understand the value of team building in an environment where individualism is treasured?
Yes. Well, the short answer that I give generically, and it really needs to be tailored to an organization because every company has its own unique culture, right? So if the company culture is one that values the individuals over teamwork, here's my thought though. Projects or DevOps or whatever the work is really a mechanism for fulfilling the strategic, at that highest level, for fulfilling the strategic objectives of the organization. Most work gets done, according to the literature, through projects. And here, that would also include DevOps as well. So individuals can, outside of projects, can do work and are of great value. But there's a reason that people are assembled typically to get endeavors done or projects. We know they have a unique scope and start date and end date and budget and so on. And that's really speaks to projects. So if the company perhaps doesn't do project work, I don't know what can be added to my comments related to that question. But most organizations, and they may not call it projects, right? They may not call it a project. They may not even call it a team. They may call themselves a tribe or something else. But they're typically, this is what's typically done in organizations, is getting work done by forming a group of people together. By the way, one thing I'd like to do is to address a frequently asked question that I didn't already cover, and that is, which kind of relates indirectly to the question, which I thought might be of interest, and that is group versus team. So my example, my version of the elevator example is this. A group is a group of people who happen to have something in common, like they're in the elevator, taking an elevator ride together. However, that same group in that elevator, and the elevator is broke, and they've been in there for an hour, and the alarm button's not working, and the phone in the elevator isn't working, and they can't hear anything from outside the elevator, and there's no cell phone reception in the elevator, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to get out of there. They're now a team. They're working to get out of there. They're a team. So work can be done individually. Work can be done by groups, but it's teams that are really aligned with a common vision or a mission or a scope to getting work done. I think is the best way I can answer that in summary.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. And I definitely know what I get the distinction that you're trying to make between the groups and the teams. So from what I understand, teams, you're not a group isn't a team until they actually put in some actions together to accomplish a certain goal. Correct?
Yes, that's quite right.
Fantastic. Thank you. One of our audience members, Chris, asks if you could provide some real life examples in addition to the team development theory. Do you think you could provide any examples that you've come across with working with all your clients when you from the forming to the adjourning phase? That definitely stick to your mind.
Can you ask that question one more time,
Yeah,
please?
yeah. Do you have any real life examples or experiences that you've had working with specific clients where that you could provide any anecdotes where with clients that you've worked with from the forming to adjourning phase?
Oh, sure. So, I mean, there's countless examples. The one thing I do want to mention, which I thought you were getting at initially, but I'd like to zoom in on it anyways, and that is the adjourning phase. So again, that's Dr. Tuckman's update to his model, and he was really ahead of his time in many ways. Today, adjourning is called by the Project Management Institute. This would be sort of analogous to closeout or finishing the project. And I remember a presentation given at a Project Management Institute keynote. And that presenter showed a study that reflected that adjourning, what's here called adjourning, in project management terms from the PMI, it was called closeout or finishing the project off, was one of the most important but neglected phases. And the literature that he cited, which I read after the keynote, talked about how companies who don't do adjourning are really missing out on an opportunity to motivate, again, not only the people who are on the team, but also the entire organization around the hard work and due diligence and success of the work of the endeavor. And also the lessons learned, sometimes called post-project review, post-mortem, retrospective. Again, it doesn't matter what the label is, but capturing that information and incorporating it to the extent appropriate to the environment, so that the company's in a better state for the next time there's a project that's of this type or even something roughly similar, so that there'll be even bigger success the next time around. So it's by doing things like including adjourning, which here is referred to as adjourning, that can go a really long ways in helping the individuals, the team as a whole, and also the entire company celebrate the successes and everything that comes along with that. One other example that I touched on briefly was that somebody who attended a conference I did in Europe for a DevOps summit commented that once she saw the characteristics of storming, she realized that a project that she had joined was in the storming phase for the duration. And the whole point of getting to performing to the extent that you can as quickly as possible is for obviously the higher level of performance. But again, with that, and that's why I included it in the title of this talk, is the satisfaction and happiness when you do things like pulse surveys is the highest during the performing phase, which I suppose might be not a surprise, but and then adjourning as well, which is really just finishing off the project. So this was a few months ago when I got that feedback from her during this talk I gave a few months ago, and so she had shared with me. And by the way, I offer this to you as well. I realize that sometimes there may not be a question during the actual talk. Maybe you have a question later. And so to that end, my information on the IEEE website for this talk includes a link to my bio or my website, and there you'll see, ways to connect with me through LinkedIn or email or Facebook or Twitter. And so there's a variety of ways you can reach out to me even after this talk. So getting back to this person who shared the feedback about how she was in the storming phase for the duration of the project, she said that on the next project, she printed out the takeaway, because I did a version of the takeaway for that conference as well, and showed it to the team, the next team she was on, and said, let's keep track of where we are, and if there's any problems, let's take care of it. And she was really taking the lead informally. Title-wise, she wasn't the most senior person on the project, but she took the lead and she made a contribution, and she suggested that for everyone's benefit, not just hers, that the team try to get to the performing phase as quickly as possible using the proven strategies from the literature, which are extracted and presented here to you in this visual.
Great, thank you so much. Chris, I hope that gave some insight and provided it was a good answer for you. Chuck, or excuse me, this next question from Chuck. So how do you strongly challenge those with resources or authority without coming off as defensive or resentful?
Can you say it one more time, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So how can you challenge those with the resources or authority without coming off as defensive or resentful? So I guess in this, I guess what I'm assuming is as a team member towards the leader of said team, if you disagree with the team leader, how can you kind of provide your argument without coming off as defensive or you know um, without any animosity?
Yeah, so I think that this, I'll be kind of generic because it depends on the particulars depend on the exact situation and the culture of the organization. And by culture, I mentioned where the company is and maybe where it wants to go, which may be a little bit different from where it is. But it's one thing I try to uncover when I do consulting is knowing where they are is very important, but knowing also where they want to go, right? Because things may change as it relates to culture. But going back to the question, just to be as friendly and as professional and as come across as sincere and as helpful as you are, because that's just really good, simple advice for anyone at any level in any situation, right? Without knowing the particulars of the exact conflict. But I will say this, Dr. Tuckman's quite clear that storming is one of the 5 phases, and it is normal. It happens, according to the literature, more often and for maybe a longer duration in 2 types of scenarios, or a combination of 2. One is people have not worked together, or most of the people have never worked together before. The second scenario is folks are being asked to do something that's never been done in the company before, ever. And of course, it's possible to have a double whammy, right? To have both of those be true. But the reality is that these are the strategies that are shared here to help the team move from storming to norming. In mature organizations who are successful and have typically worked together before and typically are doing the same kinds of projects. Of course, every project is unique by definition. They tend to move through forming and storming and norming relatively quickly compared with other scenarios and get to the performing phase. But the great news is, from the literature, is if it isn't clear where their team is overall, here are the characteristics to help sort of diagnose where the team is, and then the strategies. One thing I would like to mention that question has me thinking about, sort of indirectly related to the question, and that's this. Can the team ever go backwards? Might be a question that I'm kind of thinking about when I heard that question. And the answer is yes. Let me give 1 or 2 scenarios to answer that might be interesting and helpful. Let's say a team is in the performing phase. And here's one scenario, the highest level of performance. Everything's going great. And here's one scenario. One scenario is the project manager is leaving the organization, but it's a planned exit, like a retirement, for example. And knowing that, there has been another project manager who's been kind of shadowing, if you will, that project manager and is ready to become formally involved in this endeavor when the project manager on this long-term large project, leaves the organization. And perhaps in that scenario, as measured by the characteristics, the team continues in performing, right? Let me give you another example, though. The same situation, except for this. The project manager wins the lotto, and none of this $10,000 business. We're talking, the $10 million, $100 million lotto. If I'm going to do a scenario, might as well make it a big one. And they leave suddenly with no, without any without any notice. They leave immediately. It's entirely possible that, as measured by the characteristics or the description, the team is back in the storming phase. It's not like the team is consciously saying, well, the project manager is gone, or whoever that person is, therefore we must now be in storming, but rather as measured by the characteristics. But the good news is, if a team was in the performing phase and they get moved back into storming for whatever reason, in a DevOps situation, maybe because that's continuous, right, versus a project, to give another DevOps example, maybe 5 new people join the DevOps team. So they're back in the forming phase, right? They weren't performing, they're back in forming. But anyways, the point is that these are the characteristics of where the team is to help diagnose them. And then these are the strategies to help them move on, which means move to the next phase. Thank you for that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Scott. And we actually did have a question from one of our audience members, Gabby, who you probably answered her question when she asked, how is it possible for a team to go backwards from the performing phase, which you just described a scenario. So Gabby, I hope that answered your question as well. Folks, because of the volume of questions that we still have remaining, we'll take a few more minutes to get to as many of them as we can. So Scott, this next question, and we're going to combine this with a couple questions from our audience, similar questions. How do we remove the underperformer without affecting the morale of the team? And also, how do we remove a disruptive team member as well?
Yes, and so thank you for that and all of the questions and feedback. I appreciate them all. That question or that scenario isn't one that any model can on its own automatically solve for you, because again, it depends on the particulars and the culture of the organization. For example, I think it's important to kind of give 1 or 2 examples, and sometimes I do a best case, a worst case, right? And then most things fall somewhere in between. But maybe absolute worst case, this has only happened a couple of times in the last 10 years, but things aren't going well and the person's immediate supervisor and HR need to be involved, right? But that's not typical. It's extremely rare. More commonly is whatever the issue or problem is. I kind of touched on maybe a version of this question earlier on during Q&A, is to not let things accumulate. It's really important to handle questions and issues and problems as quickly as possible. I have a former supervisor who had a little saying. It's a little bit silly, but I'd like to share it anyways. That won't stop me. And that is, issues are not like a fine wine. They don't get better with age. And so handling things when they're small or when they're new versus when they accumulate and they get bigger is the best way to go. But if you're not able to resolve them, whatever is the right next step in the organization. Some companies, it's talking after you've already worked with the individual person. If that doesn't work, maybe in some companies, it's talking with that person's supervisor. And there may be a decision to possibly replace that person. Worst case scenario, In some organizations, before that happens, HR needs to get involved. Those are not typical examples, but these are things that do happen. And I got the sense that there might be a very serious concern that the person wanted me to take a stab at. And I think that this model really just speaks, as it relates to the question, speaks to trying to resolve things as quickly as possible, having feedback be as seamless and as frictionless as possible so that you're hearing about problems, large and small, right away versus later on, and tackling them as they surface. Otherwise, a potential consequence will be that the team will be in the storming phase for longer than necessary, far longer than necessary, because the team as a whole isn't performing, I think was really the gist of the question. I hope that helps.
Great. Thank you for that insight, Scott. This next question, audience member Yana asks, do you have any advice to a new team leader? And she goes on further to clarify, a person who didn't choose to be a leader, but was essentially forced to take on the role. And do you have any?
Well, first of all, congratulations, you're a leader now. I mean, that happened to me. I think a lot of us can relate to that. That's kind of what happens. And, in one of my when I was working with a major entertainment company, my first real job out of college, I was told, congratulations, you're now a manager. And they didn't have the title at that company of project manager at the time, but that's what it was, right? That's what it was managing projects. So it was like, congratulations, you're now the project manager. So this is what I did, and this is what might be helpful in response to this question, and that is look to authorities and organizations. The IEEE has an abundance of webinars and information that you can access, many of which for free. The Project Management Institute, likewise, an authority in project management. In terms of Agile, there is the Agile Alliance and Scrum Alliance, amongst others, which have programs both for certification and training and just free information that's out there. So there's that. But also because every company is different, no surprise there, maybe finding a mentor within your organization of someone who's successful doing what it is that you are now new at, and that is being a leader, whether you're a project manager or otherwise, and maybe having that person provide some mentorship can probably go a very long ways to help you in your situation. And I hope that helps.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Yana, hope that was able to provide some insight for you. Scott, so this will be our final question. Paul asks, when taking over a long-established team that has had issues in meeting their objectives, should I move them forward from their current phase or take them back to their first phase?
Well, there's the literature, which my experience and the literature would say this. You look at where the team is, and if they are in the performing phase, that is the highest level of performance. So let's start there, right? So you wouldn't, I don't think, want to deliberately move the team into a lower level of performance. You would want to maintain the performing phase. Of course, every organization, what peak performance means varies, right? There can still be an issue or a problem or a question in the performing phase. That doesn't mean that you automatically are moved to the storming. You really look to the characteristics. If it isn't obvious, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, frankly. If you look at the characteristics as sort of the diagnostic criteria, here is where the team is. Then you look at the strategies for, in the case of performing, because it's an active phase, maintaining the momentum. If you're not in the performing phase, you look at the strategies as things to help the team move to the next phase. So I can't think of, nor does the literature speak to, a scenario where you would deliberately move a team from, for example, performing to forming. It's simply a byproduct of where the team is. When new people join the team, The most common reason for the team to go from performing back to forming is because people have left the team and or new people have joined. But the good news is if the team was already in the performing phase, they're going to get from forming to storming to norming much quicker than they did the first time. That's what the literature says, and I've also seen this in the real world. And so thank you for the feedback and the questions. I appreciate them all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Scott. Well, again, thank you so much for providing your audience for providing our audience your insight into working in and leading teams effectively and successfully, Scott. Thank you for all the insight you've provided.
Yes, and on that last slide, I'd like to speak to, I hope that all the attendees are able to apply this information to help the team be happier and more productive and successful in its endeavors. This speaking to both project work as well as DevOps work. And thank you very much.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in and for your great questions. As mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending a short survey to our registrants after this event and would love your feedback regarding this webinar. You can also access Scott's digital resource from the comment section. We provided the link. Check back daily on our social media for future live stream updates, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day.